It's 12, so let's start. Good afternoon, everyone, colleagues and distinguished guests. As usual, this seminar is being recorded and will be posted within 48 hours on the IEO website. Today, you'll hear about industrial policies, friendshoring, export controls, and sanctions, the rise of so-called economic security policies, and how the IMF, along with its member countries, are navigating these challenges. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the IEO seminar series. I'm Hélène Poirson, advisor at the IEO. Today, we're going to focus mostly on industrial policies because it's the new thing that countries are using to guide the structural transformation of their economies as they emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic and face rising geopolitical tensions and the accelerating effects of climate change in 2024 and the outer years. You'll also hear about export controls and sanctions, other tools that countries are using to buttress their economic security and achieve their so-called de-risking goals. We have three amazing speakers today on these topics. Their combined expertise should provide us with invaluable insights into the evolving landscape of economic security. My first guest speaker is Emily Benson. She is the director of the project on trade and technology at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, D.C. With her extensive background in political science and international affairs, Emily brings a critical perspective on the intersection of trade, investment, and technology issues. Her commentary and research have appeared in publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Policy, and Emily is regularly quoted in major news outlets. You will hear from her about the economic security agendas that are being implemented by key global actors and how export controls are being redefined in this era of economic security policies. Next, we're privileged to have as our second guest speaker, Daria Zakharova, Deputy Director of the Strategy, Policy, and Review Department at the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Daria's insights into the IMF strategic policy formulation are super timely, especially as the organization adapts its surveillance to address geoeconomic fragmentation and new industrial policies, including measures that are driven by national security aims, green industrial policies, and those featuring trade provisions. Today, Daria will delve into the IMF's broad considerations on how industrial policy is covered within its surveillance activities as detailed in the recent communication to the Executive Board. This encompasses the macro-critical aspects of these policies, their cross-border implications, and their alignment with national security objectives. And finally, we are honored to welcome as our third guest speaker, Elina Ribakova. Elina is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Elina's research focuses on global markets, economic statecraft, and economic sovereignty. Her expertise in financial markets and research has led her to a distinguished career at the IMF for a decade, followed by senior roles at the Institute for International Finance and also in the private sector, including Deutsche Bank and Citigroup. Elina will bring us her insights on sanctions, including their effectiveness and how to better enforce export controls. So with such a great panel, we look forward to an engaging discussion. I encourage you all to actively participate. There will be an opportunity for open discussion at the end of the session. Please hold your questions until then. We're eager to hear your thoughts and to engage in a dialogue on this topic. If you prefer, you can post your questions in the chat as we go along, or post your name and I'll call on you once we get to the Q&A. So once again, thank you for joining us. We're going to begin this session with our first speaker, Emily. Emily, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. It's a real pleasure, especially to be on an all-female panel for International Women's Month. So I think that's a coincidence, but a happy one. So thank you again for including me in today's discussion. I sit at the intersection of trade and technology, which I think in many ways crosscuts not only export controls and advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and increasingly quantum technologies, but also various elements of the green transition. I'd like to focus my remarks today on whether or not we are experiencing a profound shift in approaches to trade and globalization. And in some ways, this is actually quite a difficult question to answer, but I think at the end of the day, the answer is fairly clear. which is that we are experiencing a very seismic shift in the way that the United States and its close friends and partners are navigating these increasingly geopolitical headwinds. The major question is how economic security fits into this this dialogue. And let me begin by identifying, I think, three commonalities that the United States maintains with its partners, and then three major differences that distinguish the US approach to international economic governance. So the first big commonality is that economic security is really the term du jour. Last summer in June, the European Commission unveiled a very comprehensive white paper on its economic security strategy. It recently, at the end of January, further articulated that strategy in a series of white papers. Essentially, what this does is articulate the Commission's approach to de-risking, which is something that the European Commission President von der Leyen coined about this time last year. This is acknowledging that the European Union is coming increasingly into the United States viewpoint that China and trade exposure to China poses a fundamental risk to both economic and political stability in the European Union. What's interesting about the European Commission security approach is that the Commission is attempting to consolidate some degree of authority over its strategic trade toolkit. This is evidenced not only in its consolidation or attempted consolidation of export control authorities, but also increasingly in the inbound and potentially outbound investment screening domains. Another commonality between the United States and its partners is that as they engage more deeply in the economic security domain, they will have to contend with higher costs of this big reshuffle. So the idea is that just-in-time supply chains, again, create vulnerabilities and that those will have to move closer to home. There's some interesting data to suggest that nearshoring is occurring, but that the source country is still China. And so if you look at various commodities, they're essentially being routed through Vietnam and Malaysia, through Mexico to the United States. And so for products like medical supplies, what that means is that costs are increasing, but vulnerabilities are not decreasing. So basically, we have the same degree of risk exposure, but we're paying more for the same inputs. So I think that's something that will have to be corrected moving forward. Another commonality is that an expanded economic security net necessarily invites additional retaliation from the Chinese. We saw this very acutely transpire last summer when China announced gallium restrictions and germanium restrictions on the United States and some of its partners in response to the expanded export controls on advanced semiconductors to China. What's interesting here is that at the time, a lot of commentators said, well, China doesn't really mean it. They won't end up restricting any of these inputs in the semiconductor supply chain. However, China did ultimately halt all gallium exports to the country of Japan. Why that's interesting is that China is essentially saying, if you come on board with the US approach to economic security, but you're a smaller economy than the United States, we will ratchet up pressure on your specific economy. Luckily, Japan was able to scale up additional production of gallium. They have weathered the storm. I think it was kind of an annoyance at the end of the day, but it's a very good indication of what to expect moving forward. We saw a similar dynamic play out on October 20th when European Commission leaders came to Washington for what was supposed to be a major summit on the green transition. This was when we were supposed to have news about the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum, or the ongoing negotiations related to a critical minerals agreement, the CMA, between Brussels and Washington. On that exact day, the Chinese announced restrictions on graphite, which is a critical mineral used in the production of batteries for electric vehicles. And so already we see this sort of signaling back and forth between the Transatlantic Alliance and China demonstrating that it can really use some of its muscle power over supply chains to endanger the green transition if it feels like it's put into a corner by this expanded economic security net. So as economic security accelerates, again, countries will need to contend with some of the costs borne out by retaliation. So those are three commonalities. Three differences that distinguish the United States approach, as I identify it, is that for the United States, policymakers increasingly regard China primarily as a threat and secondarily as a customer. This is very different from other countries or other blocs like the European Union, especially Germany, which continues to view China as primarily a market for exports, as primarily a customer. In the United States, this has manifested in a hardening of the national security trade toolkit through export controls, investment screening, and more recently, data controls. And so I'll just unpack a little bit of the contours of those various tools. So at the end of the Cold War, the United States went about liberalizing a degree of its high-tech trade with Russia under the assumption that it could verify that certain technologies were getting into Russia and were not being used by the military. So this ushered in a period of end user based export controls. If you can figure out that the person is who they claim to be and that they're using the technology in accordance with the terms of their license, then we can go ahead and permit that export. What the October 7th, 2022 export controls do is say that any high-grade chips above a certain threshold going to China risk leaking to the military. This is a very profound change because embedded in that policy change is the assumption that we can no longer distinguish between a military and a civilian end user in China. So this is really a seismic shift. I think in some ways, if you look at the specific thresholds of which chips are controlled, it is relatively narrow. But philosophically, this is quite a broadening of what the US deems critical to trade and national security. The same has also transpired similarly on outbound investment screening. And here on August 9th, 2023, the administration put forth an executive order that for the first time would create an outbound screening regime for capital and knowledge transfers going to China. Here, the covered sectors are artificial intelligence, quantum technology, and semiconductors. And the US is essentially saying, please go ahead and proceed with the transaction, except in a couple of very specific cases, and let us know after the fact that you've completed the transaction. This is a method of gathering additional information about the value and nature of these transfers going to China. The assumption here is that the United States already has an export control regime that covers outbound items and technologies. We also have CSIS, which screens inbound national security critical investments. And so that creates a sort of conspicuous gap in US flows that could be helping Chinese startups get off the ground. Last week, the administration unveiled, I think, a very far-ranging policy that would control bulk data transfers. So this is sort of the national security equivalent of the EU's GDPR. The 6 categories of data that the White House is seeking to control cover things like human genomic data or geolocation information about troops. In very concrete terms, something that's come up recently is that the Chinese app 23andMe, which contains genetic data, is probably going to face insolvency very soon. And there are currently no restrictions on who can buy this bulk data. And so that includes politicians, political leaders, activists, normal American citizens. And so there are some concerns about foreign adversaries being able to kind of vacuum up a lot of that data. So I think altogether that points to a much more hardened national security instrument approach to trade that in some ways is supplanting the trade liberalization of yesteryear. This in turn leads to a third difference between the United States and many of its international partners is that the US is not really coupling or offsetting some of these costs incurred from a more geopolitical agenda with an affirmative trade agenda. We've seen this play out repeatedly in discussions about the local content requirements from the Inflation Reduction Act, or even some of the provisions from the Chips and Science Act. So what the United States is essentially doing is saying, we'd like to reshore, ideally, we're open to friendshoring. And we're also simultaneously asking a lot of our partners when it comes to widened restrictions on trade, but we don't have that counterbalance on providing market access or real concessions. And I think that's a little bit of a blind spot for this current approach, is that allies and partners need to feel bought in, and they need to feel like there's some sort of offset to costs incurred from this agenda. What that means is that the United States will have to do a better job of leading the future of trade policy. And I think we can unpack a little bit what that means. But in my estimation, the future of trade in the next 10 or 15 years will probably be focused on supply chain security issues. We've seen this play out also repeatedly in bills that are currently being introduced in both the House and the Senate here. With one major caveat, which is that there are riders attached to these security supply chain bills that would revoke permanent normal trade relations with China. So current estimates say that if we were to revoke PNTR for China, we would usher in essentially overnight an average tariff rate of 30% on all inbound items from China, which would be economically catastrophic in every sense. And so we'll have to sort through the geopolitics of how to craft a supply chain security strategy that works for the United States and its foreign partners. There have been various attempts to secure supply chain deals, both through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and its Latin American Mirror Initiative. The IPEF supply chains pillar is coming into effect, I think, this month, very shortly. And a lot of that work is being carried out in an interagency process that the White House is coordinating. So in conclusion, I think what we're seeing is a completely new paradigm shift that is unlikely to change under different political leadership in the United States. Very unfortunately, I think we're heading into an era of more autarkic economic relations where we don't really have adequate rules of the road. We don't yet have a paradigm for reducing fratricide and economic security policies or minimizing collateral damage. And that's something that we'll have to do. And we need to do that at the international and multilateral level. And I think we're doing ourselves a little bit of a disservice by punting that conversation further down the road. And I fear that we'll wake up in 5 years and wish that we'd had that conversation this year. So hopefully we can discuss a little bit of that in our conversation today. Thank you again.
Thank you, Emily. This is fantastic. And it reminds me why I approached you in the first place to give this talk, because I think you're stepping away from the usual dualism of, okay, either we have full trade liberalization or we have blocks and completely fragmented geopolitical landscape. You're saying, you know, the reality is this strategies on supply chain securities are key. Countries are not going to let them go, but we have to come up with an approach that achieves some sort of not just a compromise, but that's good for everybody, both the key actors and their partners. So, I mean, I think it's a wonderful way to start, like you said, the dialogue on these. So we'll have the dialogue at the end. For now, I'm going to give the floor to our second speaker, Daria. And Daria is going to discuss with us today the communication with the board, this document, which offers a comprehensive approach to various facets of industrial policy, including the importance of institutions, robust institutions, clear implementation plans, and mitigating risks such as rent seeking and corruption to ensure that these policies are sustainable. So Daria, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Helen. I think I have a presentation that your colleagues were going to project.
Yes, that's right.
All right, thank you so much. There we go. Here we go. So my talk today is not just about industrial policy, but it will touch upon many of the issues that we just discussed that are related to what we call geoeconomic fragmentation. So my presentation is based on the recent IMF staff discussion note on geoeconomic fragmentation, and also on our recent analytical work on new industrial policy activity, some of which was mentioned in the previous talk, including US IRA, for example. Work on geoeconomic fragmentation and industrial policy at the fund has been motivated by the recent alarming trends in global economic integration. Globalization has slowed after the global financial crisis, and now there are growing signs of strains of the global economic system. And we might be actually on the brink of reversal, or even in not just slowdown, but reversal of economic integration that has been happening in the second half of the 20th century. So the economic recovery following the global financial crisis coincided with a growing number of military conflicts and a growing debate, especially in advanced economies, about the value of multilateralism and the unequal benefits of globalization. Brexit in 2016 was an example of this broader trend, and it was followed very soon by a series of protectionist measures in trade between the United States and China. And then we were hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, and among other measures that countries took in response were restrictions to the movement of goods and people. And some of these restrictions, of course, were necessary to address the pandemic, but some others, such as restrictions on exports of key medical products, exacerbated pandemic-related disruptions. Then the war in Ukraine split countries along geopolitical lines and resulted in sanctions which have disrupted trade, tested the global financial architecture, and heightened tensions and uncertainty over the direction of globalization. So on this slide, you see in the left-hand side chart that global flows of goods and capital have plateaued since the global financial crisis, although services continue to rise from a small base. On the right-hand side chart, you see that trade restrictions have risen steeply since well before the pandemic. So moving to the next slide, just to give you a, next slide, please, to give you a quick overview of the staff discussion note on geoeconomic fragmentation, which was published last year. So what do we mean by geoeconomic fragmentation? Our definition is that it is a policy-driven reversal of economic integration, often guided by strategic considerations such as national security, economic security, strategic autonomy. Note that geoeconomic fragmentation does not encompass all instances of a reversal of global integration. For example, if trade slows down because consumer preferences shift from goods which tend to be tradable to services which tend to be non-tradable, this does not comprise geoeconomic fragmentation. So in this staff discussion note, we explore various channels through which fragmentation can impact on the global economy. And not surprisingly, the channels are the same as the channels through which the benefits of globalization have been transmitted to global and domestic economies. So fragmentation can impact the global economy through changing patterns of trade, technology, labor, capital, and the provision of global public goods. So intuitively, barriers to trade could raise prices, reduce efficiency, and dampen growth. Reduced technological diffusion could harm innovation and productivity spillovers. Barriers to migration could reduce knowledge diffusion and risk sharing, and reduced capital flows could hinder financial deepening and constrain investment. So we've done several studies on the potential costs of geoeconomic fragmentation, all using computable general equilibrium models to quantify how various aspects of fragmentation, in particular trade and technological fragmentation, affect GDP. So needless to say, a lot hinges on assumptions on how the world would split into blocks, or whether there would be a number of non-aligned countries. So there is a wide range of estimates, but we can say that if there is limited fragmentation and there is low adjustment costs, such as switching to new trading partners and recalibrating supply chains, then the costs would be pretty low, somewhere near zero. But if you have the world splitting into blocks that don't trade with each other, and countries have a hard time replacing suppliers from an opposing bloc, then you could have GDP impact as high as 7%. And with technological decoupling, output loss could reach 12% in some countries. So this could be potentially very disruptive to the global economy. So how do we move from here? How do we mitigate the risks of fragmentation and try and contain the costs, economic costs associated with it? So in the staff discussion note, we propose something called the pragmatic approach to multilateralism. Basically, the current system needs to adapt to the changing global economy. But unfortunately, the current geopolitical environment makes it difficult to reform the rules-based multilateral system. And trust may have to be rebuilt gradually through differential engagements, depending on the extent of alignment of countries' preferences and actions. So let's look at the next slide and see how this sort of pragmatic multilateralism may look. So we propose sort of a three-pillar approach to rebuilding trust. The first pillar, the green pillar, is an area where multilateral effort could still work and achieve tangible results. Some issues that could be tackled under this pillar are the issues that are common. They're common challenges to all countries, and we hope that countries can unite around them and work together to resolve them. Of course, climate change is there, food security is there, pandemic preparedness, possibly debt resolution, and some trade tensions could possibly still be resolved at the multilateral level. Now, when multilateral negotiations stall, then we would propose open and non-discriminatory plurilateral initiatives, where you would have fewer countries wanting to do more. This could be a practical way forward, for example, to address behind-the-border trade distortions, such as the domestic content requirements that were mentioned in the previous intervention, and to develop digital cross-border payment systems, for example. And then, of course, you can expect that in this small fragmented world, there would be countries that would choose sometimes to go for unilateral actions. Such actions may be beneficial from the perspective of a particular country that takes these actions, but it may have unintended spillovers to other countries. And so here we propose guardrails that may be needed to mitigate global spillovers and protect the vulnerable. Such guardrails could include commonly agreed norms of conduct, for example, safe corridors for essential products and services, multilateral consultations to share information on policies, examine spillovers, and ways to address them. So in this environment, what would be the role of the fund? Well, to be effective in this environment, the fund needs to continue being representative of its global membership. It is very important for us to remain even-handed and impartial in our policy advice and operations. And of course, we need to be adequately resourced in a global environment that could be subject to more frequent shocks. All right, so what have we done so far in terms of informing the global community about potential costs of fragmentation? Maybe we can look at the next slide. So since the start of the war in Ukraine, we have seen an increase in surveillance work at the IMF focused on geoeconomic fragmentation. In terms of flagship reports, the April World Economic Outlook covered the potential long-term losses in global output due to shifting foreign direct investments. The October World Economic Outlook last year focused on fragmentation in global commodity markets, highlighting the risks to food security and the green transition. The April Global Financial Stability Report flagged risks to global financial stability as rising tensions could trigger cross-border capital outflows and increased uncertainty in financial markets. Also, all of our regional or area departments have produced by now reports or working papers on the implications of fragmentation for their regions and countries in their regions. And then we now also covered fragmentation in several Article 4 consultations, which is our primary vehicle for bilateral surveillance. including, for example, for staff reports for Australia, China, and India. And so now I will turn to industrial policy. That is actually one of the symptoms of fragmentation. So with fragmentation looming, industrial policy is making a comeback. Industrial policy can be narrowly defined as targeted government interventions, so-called vertical policies aimed at supporting specific domestic firms, industries, or economic activities to achieve certain national or economic or non-economic objectives. So this differs from what we call horizontal policies, which aim to improve the general business environment for all firms and industries in the economy. For example, by strengthening governance, the rule of law, promoting the ease of doing business, or developing infrastructure. So we decided to look more closely at what our teams see on the ground. So we did the text analysis of IMF Article 4 staff reports to search for the term industrial policy. And the main finding there is that industrial policy regained attention around the 2010s, and particularly in advanced economies. It used to be a feature of emerging markets and low-income countries, but now it has spread to advanced economies. The use of restrictive trade measures surged with the intensification of trade tensions in 2017 and 2018, especially after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, as you can see on the left-hand side chart. Notwithstanding data limitations, the latest industrial policy wave as of 2023 has been led by advanced economies, and that you can see on the right-hand chart. So moving to the next slide, recently the sector product focus of industrial policy shifted from medical goods, which dominated during the COVID-19 pandemic, to advanced technologies and their inputs. In 2023, the sectors that have seen most industrial policy activity have been military, civilian, dual-use products and advanced technology products, including semiconductors and low-carbon technologies, as well as their upstream inputs, such as critical minerals. You can see that on the left-hand side chart. Industrial policy measures have been motivated by competitiveness, climate mitigation, supply chain resilience, and national security considerations, as you can see on the right-hand side chart. On the next slide, we tried to unpack how country teams handled the recent wave of industrial policies. And so we conducted a staff survey in the fall last year. The survey covered the period from end 2021 to August 23. And the results of the survey suggest that country teams were generally able to judge macro criticality of the new industrial policies, as well as their potential to generate cross-border spillovers. Based on the survey, about a quarter of countries, 48 countries, introduced industrial policy, and that policy was deemed macro critical by staff. More than 2/3 of macro critical policies in advanced economies were viewed as having the potential to trigger cross-border spillovers. And what is interesting to note is that for emerging market countries that implemented industrial policies, staff was of the view that in about 2/3 of such cases, the stated objectives could have been achieved by using horizontal or macro structural policies rather than industrial policies. Looking at the prevailing industrial policy objectives, staff survey shows different motives. In advanced economies, industrial policy has been mainly motivated by climate and security considerations. This is shown in green and red, respectively. While for emerging markets and low-income economies, the key motivations included growth, diversification, and export performance, shown in yellow and various shades of blue. So, from this, we moved on to think about how to cover industrial policy in IMF surveillance. So not all industrial policy needs to be discussed in staff reports. We have a guidance on surveillance published in 2022. And that guidance would imply that industrial policy, like any other economic policy, should be covered in bilateral surveillance if it is macro-critical, meaning that it can significantly influence present or prospective balance of payments or domestic stability, or it can potentially generate significant cross-border spillovers for other countries or affect the effective operation of the international monetary system. So then the next question that we asked, how to cover policies that where the stated objective is national security. So in such cases, because we do not have expertise on such policies, staff should not discuss if such policy is appropriate or propose alternative policies to help achieve the stated objectives of national security. But we are expected to discuss economic implications if deemed macro-critical or if these implications may generate significant cross-border spillovers. So that basically delineates when we can opine on policies, industrial policies, and when we cannot. So the determination of whether given policy is macro-critical is up to country teams. It's up to team judgment. Whether given policy is macro-critical would depend on its type and scope, as well as on countries' macroeconomic, structural, and institutional characteristics. Generally, industrial policy involving fiscal, monetary, and financial policy tools would always be considered macro-critical and covered in our staff reports. The macro-criticality assessment of other policies would require judgment and may change over time. And so then I will conclude with the next steps in this area of work on geoeconomic fragmentation and IP. So the future work will focus on tracking, measuring, and monitoring trends in geoeconomic fragmentation and industrial policy. One area is addressing data and information gaps for analysis of trade and financial flow patterns that could be attributed to fragmentation and industrial policies. We will also keep monitoring new industrial policy and trade policy measures to inform bilateral and multilateral surveillance. And this will be done in collaboration with Global Trade Alert. In terms of the impact of measures on trade flows, we recently launched the Port Watch platform, which tracks disruptions in global shipping. I encourage you to check it out. It's a publicly available platform. More analytical work will be needed to help our membership adapt to fragmentation and design non-distortionary industrial policies. This will need to be tailored to country-specific needs while being mindful of even-handedness. And finally, we will keep developing analytical tools that can be used to better understand the economic impact of new industrial policy and trade policy measures. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Daria. I'm just struck. So also not just the discussion of industrial policy, like you said, but also the context and how these industrial policies are the tip of the iceberg, right? There's this trend towards fragmentation that's been happening, and these measures are just one of the flowers that sprouted from this trend. So yeah, so that's super helpful. But I'm just struck by how it seems that the IMF is really shifting from sort of warning about the risks and running scenarios and what would happen if we fragmented into blocks that didn't trade with each other and invest with each other. So warning about the risks to now squarely going towards well, the risks are there, they've materialized, they're no longer risks, and now we need to manage and do almost damage control, and use the word, I think, mitigation, right, with things like safe corridors and things like that. So I'm just really struck how the organization has really now stepped into actively managing these new policies and how we engage with the countries. So thanks again. I think we're going to have a super interesting discussion. So before we get into the Q&A, we have our third speaker, Elina, who's going to bring her expertise on sanctions. Very interesting topic. And also, I think you'll talk a little bit about export controls as well. I'm giving the floor to you, Elina.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be in this audience and among the colleagues that we worked with so many years ago. And of course, Emily as well, who is a top expert on investment and export controls as well. So I just want to carry over from what Daria was talking about. And I was sort of curiously observing how the IMF is trying to steer away from pronouncing anything themselves on the geopolitical issues, right? Which puts the sort of the IMF in a very difficult position at times. But the problem here is for all of us economists, especially people who used to work at or still work at the IMF, is that we can no longer fully disconnect. We used to think there is a global international rules, there is WTO, we can focus on our economics and we don't have to pronounce themselves on politics or geopolitics. And I think for many economists has now just become so much more complicated because nowadays we're using tools of economic statecraft to achieve policy objectives, not just within economics, but within foreign policy, national security, even sometimes defense. And we are effectively in the world where we don't always have enough of the models to understand how the impact of industrial policy or sanctions broadly defined, and to include export controls and other measures of economic statecraft, how they affect our economies, how they spill over multilaterally, but at the same time, we also need to think, do they achieve objectives outside our discipline of economics? And unfortunately, in some cases, it is the only sort of, it appears to be the only available tool or the tool that is much less costly than going for full military or military intervention. Then, of course, oftentimes the authorities that control the critical nodes draw onto sanctions. And if you have a hammer, everything seems to be a nail. So I think this is where definitely the area of research is extremely important to create a framework, to create a doctrine, especially for large countries, which then will make them more predictable and will remove the fear of many countries around the world that the strongest win. If there is no sort of agreement, no framework, no sort of controls on what drives the use of sanctions, what are the right circumstances to use them, then of course we're left with a world where countries that are controlling the critical nodes will have all the power. And I think in the US, you might have read recent comments by Dalip Singh, specifically calling for that kind of doctrine, and partially, again, to make it clear to other countries around the world that US is not using randomly sanctions, but there are certain reasons or certain doctrine or framework behind the use of those sanctions. So I think this is probably the key first issue that I wanted to comment on. The second one is that, of course, as you, Ellen and others have mentioned, the US has moved beyond financial sector sanctions. We're used to using financial sector sanctions, use of financial sector sanctions by the US, but over the last 20, 30 years, and they can be very effective because, as I'm sure you've all read in the Henry Farrell's book on weaponized interdependence and other research in this area, if you're controlling the critical node, and US does indeed control the critical nodes in finance, financial infrastructure, US dollar, then of course you can disconnect it or threaten to disconnect it, and that can be very impactful. But US is now trying to translate that into other areas. As Emily pointed out, export controls, investment controls, and as we have seen in case of Russia with the oil markets. And so what is sanctions in the sanction or economic statecraft measure is, in the end of the day, is a market intervention, right? So you're trying to intervene in the market. You're trying to sell water in one room at a different price than in another, which sort of oil price cap might be seen as. So to create that market friction or market intervention, one has to have enough force. But at the same time, one has to be mindful of the costs and benefits of that market intervention, right? And as the US and other countries are beginning to sanction increasingly more complex and globally integrated countries, you need to also to start thinking more about the costs and benefits, and also especially the cost of sender. Because in the cases of North Korea or Iran, the proportionate, the relative size of countries is so small that it was not really an issue for the US or Western Europe. Of course, now with targeting of Russia and potentially even China, this discussion of the cost of sender needs to become more important. And then finally, I wanted to just give you a couple of examples of the impact of the sanctions that we have seen so far, or market interventions. I will first show you the result for the measure, the export controls that we have, the oil price cap. And what you see here on the left is that in terms of the Russia's seaborne crude oil, you see the dark blue line is the great majority still being shipped above $60. So there is a price cap. It's being, the idea is that one should use provision of services, of shipping services by G7 and insurance services by G7 to force Russia to sell oil below the price cap. As you can see in the fourth quarter of 23, pretty much 98.1% of all the seaborne shipments by Russia have happened above the price cap. And there are two explanations for it. One is the enforcement matters, right? It's very difficult to enforce when you're trying to do a market intervention in such a liquid, large, complex market and highly integrated market like the oil market. Of course, you'd better do it really forcefully, or otherwise you risk to be ineffective. And here the issue is implementation. And also at the same time, on the right, you see that Russia has just become much less dependent on the shipping services provided by G7. So a big change from April 2022, when 80% of everything was transported by the G7 or EU involvement, ships or insurance. As you can see, Russia, for at least crude oil, has reduced it dramatically, and now it's about 20%. So Russia has taken this oil outside potential exposure to US and coalition countries' measures. The other area where there's been also a big sort of attempt to curb Russia's, sorry about this, hold on, to curb Russia's access, Russia's military access to the critical components. There have been indeed very highly complex export controls, and we can discuss them in a second. But what we actually see is that for this high priority battlefield goods, which coalition countries have sort of identified, we see that immediately after the imposition, there is almost 50% drop. You see it on the right, but then you see a rebound. And if anything, for 2023, Russia's imports of these critical components for the battlefield goods has reduced only by about 10% relative to the pre-export controls era. And if you look at the components, their equipment, you see the large share of Western country, sorry about this, introduced, sort of being used by Russia. So I'll stop here and I'll stop sharing the screen and I'll pass it back to Hélène.
Thanks a lot, Elina. It's fascinating what's happening. Who would think would be talking about this today? But I mean, you raised the challenge of implementation. I think is similar a little bit to links up with what Emily said at the beginning, that even things that seem straightforward, oh, let's friendshore or nearshore, and it's not that straightforward. It just creates a lot of opacity and also real challenges in effectiveness of these sanctions. Are they really, and these export controls? So. And I think you also echoing some of the other speakers in terms of the costs and having a more open discussion of the costs of these types of unilateral actions or measures, and the role of key actors. So we have finished the phase of the session with the presentations, and now we're open for discussion. I will go over some of the comments already that have been put in the chat, and if you'd like to come in, maybe just raise your hand and I'll call on you. But we have Hector, I believe. Hector, would you like to come in, or shall I read your comment on the rules of origin? I can read it otherwise.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Please do. I can complement that, but
okay.
Feel free to read it.
Okay, so Hector commented that friendshoring and de-risking require rules of origin to give preferential market access to imports originating in a friendly supplier. And determining the origin of an import is always complex, but it can be done because goods can only be in one place at the time. Yet digital trade is growing much faster than traditional forms of trade, and bytes can be reproduced. Identical copies can be stored and delivered from different places. Hence, there is no way to apply current rules of origin to digital trade. How could friendshoring and de-risking be reconciled with the ubiquitous nature of bytes? And maybe I'll also read a follow-up comment. That's a really fantastic question, Hector. I have not thought about rules of origin in the digital context, but data originates from somewhere. I assume that only a deep surveillance system would be able to differentiate between actual sources of data. that would be relatively easier to determine if we're talking about personal data, but commercial data, for example, information on oil shipments on tankers transferred via satellites, would be significantly trickier. So I think both of the comments go towards the implementation challenges, but Hector, would you like to further flesh out or complement your question?
Yes, well, the point is that governments can screen bytes and determine their origin with some difficulty because VPNs are used and they can fool always the customs, we call it some way. Yet the thing that I find difficult to understand is that this friendshoring or de-risking comes from liberal economies, liberal countries, that liberal democracies, and we want to stay that way. Now China is doing it already. The point is, if we build firewalls to screen every byte that is coming through the border, assuming that that could be done and that VPNs will not be fooling public officials. Okay, is this kind of Orwellian state what we want? Because I have the impression that those that are promoting friendshoring and de-risking, which is a mild way of putting it, they haven't really thought about what are the political consequences of this and the technological possibilities, because there's no rules of origin for bytes, simply because they can be at several places at the same time. When you import a traditional form of trade, what you import, of course, it's difficult to determine what is the value added that was in Mexico and if it's coming from Mexico or China or Vietnam. But at the end of the day, it can be embarked from only one place because it's made of atoms. And atoms can be at only one place at a time. That's not the case with bytes. And digital trade is growing much, much faster than normal ways of trade. So I'm just wondering if people have thought about this.
Sure, I'm happy to respond unsatisfactorily. Put that asterisk up there first. I think your rules of origin comment is a very good one. And like I said in my note, I haven't had time to adequately think about how ROOs would apply to data. I will say that in the current context of the new tranche of data restrictions from the administration, there is an explicit recognition to only control bulk data transfers that are inherently non-expressive. And this goes back to the 1988 Berman Amendment to IEPA, from which the US derives its sanctions authority. And at the time, Max Berman, who was in Congress, thought that we needed to specifically include a carve out to make sure that information materials, as they're called, information materials would continue to flow east. And this at the time included things like cassettes or magazines, newspapers, very physical parts of information. He is still around in Washington and has decided not to publicly comment on whether or not the Berman Amendment specifically applies to data. And I think in turn, we need to have a better discussion about whether or not we treat data as a commodity. I think that it makes sense to characterize data as a commodity, and then it will more clearly fit into the taxonomies of trade rules. However, some people believe that defining data as a commodity would open it up to taxation and crack open the door further for a digital services tax. I personally think that we need to raise revenue through some means, and in an increasingly digitized economy, I favor a DST, but that's obviously very political and not welcome by the private sector. And so we pretty clearly and immediately confront these issues of how to even define data. And so I have not seen a sufficiently articulated conversation of ROOs, but I would welcome anything that you find on the topic, or if you end up writing something, I think that would really be a meaningful contribution to the community.
Thank you. I already wrote something. I'll send it to you.
Maybe I'll just, sorry. Jumping
Please,
very
Elina.
quickly, thank you so much. That we are not even at the goods level in terms of implementing and enforcing export controls. So if you think about the foreign direct product rules, it's not one rule, I think it's more than 9 now, different rules, is we don't have any data apart from data that the company provides to us in terms of production in China and potential evasion of the export controls, which some companies, companies are not really incentivized to provide this kind of data. Even if they were to provide data, we have no way of double checking it because our macroeconomic data is not set up to do assessment of the value chain's independence, right? We think differently about the balance of payments data. So there is a problem. And then over and above this foreign direct product rules that say that it has to sort of some US technology, when was it sold? What agreements were made? Once you've sold something onwards, how can you even possibly track it? So even in the goods market, a lot of the construct of the export controls is just not functioning at all. And I'll show you one quick chart just to give you an example. Even if the country of producer here on the left is coalition of sanctioning countries, as you see, the flow continues, right? It ebbs and flows, but in the end of the day, a large share of it is reaching Russia because maybe it's produced elsewhere, maybe it's sold from something else, maybe it's dispatched from yet another destination. So even not going to the complexities of data in the physical goods, we are struggling to implement and enforce export controls.
If I could just add one thing too, I think that's a shortcoming in the data controls for the administration is that they're essentially trying to build an OFAC parallel licensing regime for data exports. And so you're immediately placing the burden on exporters and their very lean, sometimes not very digitally literate staff to determine which tranches of data are going where. And as Elina has very effectively pointed out, we have a very difficult time tracking machine tools, which are huge. So I think that it will encounter some serious hurdles in the immediate future.
Very good. I mean, the data is something you did touch on, Emily, in your intervention, because you mentioned that last week the US unveiled a policy on bulk data transfers. And I was just struck by the immediate effects. You mentioned one app could go out of business because it contains genomic data. So, I mean, this is brewing, but in terms of how you actually enforce it, I think we've heard the challenges laid out very clearly here. Let's maybe shift gears towards a question that I came in the chat by Peter, and I actually had a similar question. I'll just going to read it, Peter, but if you want to come in, please do so. Peter asks, is the rising trend of economic security policies likely to entrench supply-side pressures on inflation, with consequent implications for monetary policy, particularly in advanced economies? So I think that would be for you, Daria.
Yes, I mean, this is a question that comes up a lot in our discussions with policymakers, and many central banks actually running simulations looking at how fragmentation could impact inflation. You would think that logically, yes, that would be the case. If you're making trade more expensive because you're introducing export controls, because you're disrupting supply chains, in countries, and maybe countries have taken steps to circumvent some of these policies to continue trading, it is going to become increasingly more costly for businesses to operate in this environment, and it is going to raise prices. I mean, in the steady state, yeah, we will probably stabilize at some level, but in the transition is when, in the transition to the new steady state, you would see greater supply side price pressures. And from that point of view, also to comment on the previous conversation, it's important when introducing such policies. It's important to understand, not just the security or economic security implications, but broad economic implications domestically and internationally. Some of these policies may invite retaliatory policies by trading partners, and so may make it even costlier for businesses to operate domestically. So that needs to be taken into account when introducing these policies. And then, yes, they may raise prices domestically for consumers, and there might be pushback by population to these policies, because some parts of the population are going to benefit, maybe they're employed in the sectors that are going to be protected, but other parts of consumers, are going to be hurt. So it's important to kind of take a holistic approach to thinking through these policies.
Checking that there are no other questions in the chat, but I had two follow-up questions on two aspects of what you said, Daria. The one is on the cost of these policies. There's the analysis that the IMF has done, and if there's fragmentation, the cost could be 7, 8, 10% of GDP potentially from countries having to reshuffle their supply chains and find new suppliers, etc. So that's sort of the immediate first impact cost. But then you think about the cost of the loss of transparency. As Emily had pointed in her intervention, it looks like we're friendshoring and decoupling, quote unquote, from China, but the reality is China is still the ultimate supplier. It's just more opaque. It's less transparent. And that cost, the loss of transparency is or the impact on inflation, right? That's another one. Like it may be coming from the economic security policies, but we see it in inflation. So I wonder if there's maybe a work program or something to look further into, because those costs could be even higher than the 7%. And more importantly, I think in terms of the likelihood, they're much more likely to manifest already now. The 7% of GDP or 10%, that's when it's Armageddon, we're fragmented, right? But even now, there's some cost to this opacity. So that's something I was wondering if we're looking into that. And then on the general approach to mitigating these risks, I had a question also for the panelists on whether how to reconcile. I'm hearing a little bit of two big themes. One is, I think both Emily and Elina mentioned the need for the key actors, the US and other big countries, to step up and play a leadership role in redefining either their doctrine in the case of sanctions or the future of trade policy, right? So there's effort led by some key players versus what I think I read in the slide you showed us, Daria, that we're still favoring at the IMF a sort of more multilateral or regional plurilateral approach without someone or some players that are pushing, the agenda. So I don't know if both can coexist or maybe we should converge. What are your views on how to move forward?
Maybe I'll start quickly. Sorry, Daria. So I'll just start quickly with something controversial. I think there has to be some multilateral coordination, and it's not clear which organization that should be. Of course, I'd love to point a finger at the IMF, but IMF, of course, tries to stay away from geopolitics. The issue here, otherwise, it's very hard to push big players, big international players into some sort of discipline in this area. I mean, there is some demands from within the US, including from the administration, and as Daria said, from potentially stakeholders, who do experience the negative spillover effects. There is also pushback from the industry, but it's the motivation is, I don't think, is strong enough to think about the rules of the game and the doctrine. So without external pressure and some coordinating mechanism, it's hard to see how they will. There will be a decision on it, especially as, depending on the outcome of the elections, we might have now the key allies between Europe and the US, sort of that alliance breaking up or sort of being damaged in the next year. Well, that will drive this even further away.
Yeah, I can only echo that sentiment that multilateralism is, of course, the obvious best path forward, but there's no clear institution to house those discussions. If you look at outcomes from MC13 last week in Abu Dhabi, it really leaves us wanting more. We can't sufficiently close the deal on fishery subsidies, which is vital to making sure that our oceans live another 10 years. We can't do the really urgent stuff in that framework. So where does it go? Another very uncomfortable question as an American, of course, is what is the role of US leadership in these institutions? And right now we see the United States pursuing this mini-lateral approach through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as I mentioned, or APEC, the TTC, the Quad, AUKUS, And a lot of these are really small minilaterals that are sectoral in nature. And I think that will only expedite a fragmented future. I also can only give my friend and colleague credit for this amazing metaphor, but in international relations, there are kind of two approaches that you can take to tending your garden. One is to let it grow wild, and in so doing, everything grows and flourishes, and you get more of the good stuff and more of the bad stuff. But then you lose the strategic goal to which you are aiming. If you tend your garden, you have neat rows, you see where you're going, you can see who your friends and enemies are. And I think being overly saturated with these mini-lateral approaches is kind of the first one, where it's too wild and we can't really see what's coming. And so that really does speak to the need to maybe have a tough conversation about where to house these discussions. And it can't only be with a group of highly developed economies. And I haven't seen anyone sufficiently articulate where the framework should be and how to get emerging economies to buy into the agenda, because we can't do it in a more bifurcated way.
So, Hélène, in terms of your question about non-transparency and how, the costs might actually come about much sooner than anticipated, in fact, we looked at these costs of uncertainty. And uncertainty can come up from various areas. Maybe you have not thought about all of the spillover channels when designing certain policies. Maybe you don't know how countries are going to align or non-align, and how these alliances may change over time. So we introduced sort of this broad concept of uncertainty and its implications for global output in the World Economic Outlook in April last year. And so in the context of foreign direct investment, this type of uncertainty could add another 2 to 3% of GDP losses in some regions, particularly those regions that are now trading with both hypothetical blocks, US, Europe, and China, Russia, and they don't know how other countries may react or which blocks they may choose. So this type of uncertainty may really reduce investment now, because investors would be cautious about putting their money in specific countries that they don't know whether they're going to be on the friend list or a non-friend list. So that's very true. And Elina, in terms of your comment on the role of the IMF, I mean, we do have fiduciary responsibility to 190 member countries, and we have a certain mandate, which is basically promoting external and domestic economic and financial stability. So it's important for us to stick to that. But we can play a very important role in convening our member countries, and hopefully we can be seen as an impartial and trusted player in this, representing global community and having global public goods at the heart of the institution. So for us, it's important to basically assess the kinds of spillovers and spillbacks that may result from unilateral policies. Some of these spillovers and spillbacks may not be intentional, and they may actually hurt innocent bystander countries, our members. So for us, having this convenient role where various players can meet and discuss, why they're introducing certain policies, what are the goals, what are the objectives. Maybe, others could raise a question if other types of policies that are less distortionary and have less spillovers internationally could achieve the same objectives and would be, less harmful otherwise. So having this type of dialogue is very important. And hopefully multilateral institutions can continue playing this convening role and having an open and transparent communication about these issues. And indeed, helping introduce some guardrails, for example, being able to export foods under the World Food Program, right? So that we don't end up in a state of hunger in multiple countries, in low-income countries in particular. Being able to export the essential medical goods if there is another pandemic. We need to be able to agree on these types of issues, at the very least at a multilateral level.
I mean, there's a theme of operating in a second best world, right? Second best policies, and the funds still key role in helping to address this challenge that we're really squarely in second and third best here. So.
And to adapt, you know, because the world is fragmenting. Hopefully we can prevent it from fragmenting into blocks, and in the worst possible scenario, we can keep that at least mitigated. But then there is adaptation bit where, you know, how do our members adapt to this? And then, you know, we will advise globally, but also specifically to each country in Article 4 consultations on how to do that, how to build resilience in this world.
Great. So I'm going to invite Luis to come in with, you had a question, Luis, you want to ask the panelists? Please come in.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion. I put my also my question in the chat, but I'll be succinct. To me, it's quite an interesting discussion, right? Because it's great that the IEO and the IMF are hosting this discussion. I'm interested in the political economy dynamics around the international financial architecture and who leads on these discussions, right? And as I wrote in my my question, as mentioned by Daria, the convening role, etc., depend to a large extent on the perceived impartiality of the institutions convening, right? Because particularly in this extremely politically secure, sensitive issue. And I wonder if you could speak to the challenges inherent in the lack of the fund's ability to address its own governance shortcomings, right? Its own perceptions of impartiality. You have basically a failed 16th quota review process that just was unsuccessfully completed. You have, you know, the Kristalina's mandate is about to end this year. And there's a very strong likelihood that another European MD will be appointed. And, you know, for example, the third South Conference outcome document from Kampala just in January was quite explicit in the G77 plus countries, once again calling for governance reform at the fund and the bank and international architecture more globally. So I wonder, how does the fund deal with these issues? And how does it impact its ability to really become, you know, the convener of these very sensitive discussions? Thank you.
I think, Daria, that would probably be a question for you as well. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Right. So no, I mean, these are all, of course, not easy issues. And, you know, I might not be the most qualified person to talk about governance. But more broadly, you know, it is very important to remain impartial and even-handed in our application of policies, and that's what we're striving to do. We also want to remain a representative institution, and we achieved as much as we could in Marrakesh on that, given the environment, and we will continue working on this going forward. So no question that we're very committed to remain a trusted advisor to our members.
So if I may press you though, do you think that these dynamics have impacted your ability to be perceived as impartial? Because this would be a strong message to take back to the board and the shareholders, right? That your ability to convene the discussion is challenged by the perceived lack of impartiality.
Well, I mean, I'm hoping that we don't see that yet in the data, particularly as we look at the traction of our advice and at even-handedness of advice. We strive to be as impartial as we can, but over time, yes, of course, it's important for us to remain representative of the global community and to be a voice of all of the countries. So yes, I mean, it will become an issue if we don't continue reforming with time, but we are committed to continue.
Hector, do you want to speak?
Thank you very much. It's a follow-up on Luis's question, which I find very pertinent. The two institutions that could really articulate differences between national policies on industrial policies and trade, of course, are the WTO and the IMF. Yet both institutions need serious reforms. As Reese mentioned, at the IMF, you have a representation problem. At the WTO, and I worked at both institutions, and that's why I can say how surprised I was from coming from the WTO to the IMF, because the same countries that at the WTO say, I am a developing country, I am not in a position to take more responsibilities, I need special and differential treatment in Geneva. The same countries that in Geneva were arguing they were not ready to take more trade responsibilities, at the IMF, they were arguing with very good arguments, we have outgrown our quotas, we are ready to undertake more responsibilities at the IMF. And of course, the countries that were resisting increasing the quotas of those fast growing emerging markets in Washington, in Geneva, they were saying, you are grown-ups, you should take equal trade responsibilities to the ones we have. As a result, both institutions are in deep trouble. And the only place I can imagine this can be discussed, I mean, you cannot be a teenager in Washington or a child in Washington, pretend that you are not ready to take more responsibilities in Geneva and want to be an adult in Washington. The only place I can imagine this can be discussed is in the G20. Now, I think that the IEO is in the best position that I can suppose any other institution, any other part of the IMF to go and to say, well, this is something that we have to take very seriously. I mean, it is undermining the credibility of the IMF, let alone the fact that, of course, the IMF also has a surveillance function. And we have to be sure.
So I apologize, but we reached the end of our time, so we're actually over time. I apologize for. We're to be continued. I think there are strong views expressed, and this is also outside the scope of this particular topic we discussed today. But very important. Just I think outside the scope. So. We're wrapping up. Everybody, thank you so much for listening today. Thank you again to our panelists for their insights, and to those of you who participated, asked questions. I'll see you next month, and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.